I tend to think of materialism mainly being about the contingency of things.
Insofar as we are creating and recreating the worlds that we inhabit.
Banal class restrictionism is insufficiently materialist.
I guess it's like trails and blazes with the map of getting lost, sticking labels or lists on. Fake ladies and males get their shit on, made up and murdered like women gliding with their wings gone.
Yo! What's going on? Welcome to Owls at Dawn. We are just two dudes from Southern California who studied philosophy, politics, and religion around the world and decided to start a podcast where we could bullshit with impunity. I'm Austin Hayden Smith.
I'm Troy Polidori.
And this week we have on TheLitCritGuy. Not a LitCrit guy or LitCrit guy, but TheLitCritGuy is going to be joining us, and we're going to talk about materialism and the implications of having a robust materialism and some of the pitfalls of crude materialism, and then defining what is materialism and all that kinds of shit. Yeah, Troy?
Yeah. No, I was just thinking, talking about definite and indefinite articles. If we kept the plural nature of our name, owls,
yes,
at dawn, but we wanted to have an article in front of it, would it be some owls at dawn?
I mean, we could do the definite article, but some owls at dawn is good because then that's also nice because it's like it's like inviting other people to join us. Like we are some, and you as part of our parliament are another some, so you can join us at dawn.
Yeah, I think I like it as is though, owls at dawn, because it's pretty like it's not very clear whether or not we're referring to ourselves or somebody else. There just are owls at dawn. Who's to say who they are?
That's right. I mean, I don't know. Are we the owls, or are the listeners the owls, or are we all owls?
Yeah, I don't. Who knows? Because we called them Parliament, so they could be the owls.
They're the owls, and we are. I don't know. Doesn't fucking matter. Guys, so we're actually really stoked. This is going to be the first time that we have a sponsor on our podcast. Now, I know some of you guys might be thinking, God, the ethics of sponsorship, and aren't you guys like supposed to be advocating these like utopian futures where people aren't exploited? Yes, but guess what? In the future, there will be great art, and that is why I am so stoked to actually be able to talk to you guys about Mubi. And this is not bullshit. I reached out to them. Like, I reached out to Mubi and said, guys, you've sponsored another podcast that I was on. Would you be interested in sponsoring this philosophy podcast that I do that is kind of related to the Show Me the Meaning podcast? And they were interested, and so they have said, yeah, we'll go ahead and we'll do it with you guys for a little bit. If you guys aren't familiar, Mubi is one of my favorite websites. It is an online streaming service, and rather than having just like an impossible library to sift through, it is 30 films that are available to watch or download for 30 days at a time. They're available globally, and the way that I found them, actually, Troy, I don't know if you knew about this, was because Isaiah Medina's 8888. And that was actually how I found Mubi, was because I had heard about Isaiah, and I knew that the only way to access his film at the time, and it was like totally serendipitous, the only way to access his film at the time was either through like a private screener or was through Mubi. And I was like, oh shoot, well I'll try this. I'll do a free trial for Mubi. And this is a couple years ago now. And so I did the free trial for Mubi. I watched 8888, and then I looked through their catalog that they were offering at that time, and I was like, holy shit, like these are like all like these are the films that like me and my sort of like wanky artsy like interests am fascinated by. So I was like, fuck, I'm gonna do it. And so I've been a subscriber ever since. At the moment, Mubi is going to be they're constantly running these specials, so they've got particular films that are out there that are interesting, and Troy actually just watched one last night, and he's going to talk to you about it. What'd you watch, Troy?
Yeah, I watched Y Tu Mamá También, Alfonso Cuarón's, not his first movie, but probably the first movie that really made him a big international name, right? I think it won like Best Original Screenplay or something at the Oscars, and maybe Best Foreign Film. And it was brilliant. I obviously have loved Alfonso Cuarón's big budget films over the last 15 or so years, but I had never taken the time to watch Y Tu Mamá También. Sometimes these foreign films are a little bit harder to find in good quality. And Mubi is really great for that because you get these foreign films in fantastic quality and they're available to stream. I used my Google Chromecast to do it. It was zero problem, super efficient. And the film was just fantastic. The title, of course, Y Tu Mamá También, and Your Mom Too, makes you wonder what this movie's about. And, you know, it's basically about two teenage boys from privileged backgrounds in Mexico City who go on a road trip to nowhere with a beautiful Spanish woman who has just broken up with her boyfriend or fiance or husband or something. And they basically just have sex for like 2 hours. But the film is much deeper than that. If you've seen Children of Men, Alfonso Cuarón's probably most famous film, a big part of that movie is the dystopian authoritarian nightmare happening in England behind the thriller involving Clive Owen and the young mother. And Y Tu Mamá También actually has a lot of that in it as well, as these three young people are going on this trip of pure sensuality. Political happenings are occurring right behind them in Mexico City and in the rural areas outside of Mexico City that I just found to be incredibly effective. And it deserves all the masterpiece declarations that it gets. I would encourage anybody to watch it. It's going to be on Mubi for a few more weeks, I think. So definitely get on it.
Cool. Yeah, and that's the thing that Mubi does is they do cult classics, award-winning films, festival gems, and then a lot of independent releases, foreign films that you might not be as familiar with or that you might not know how to access. So check out Mubi. And the great thing about it is that if you are an Owls at Dawn listener, they are going to be giving you a extended trial for 30 days. So it's a free 30-day trial at Mubi.com. That's MUBI.com/owlsatdawn. So go to Mubi. Again, that's Mubi.com/owlsatdawn, and you get your free trial for 30 days.
And also, if you'd like to support us individually, you can go to patreon.com/owlsatdawn. We have 2 different tiers of support for patrons. The $2 tier is Democracy Motherfuckers. That's where you get to vote on the listener-supported episodes. I believe right now a poll is currently up. Is that right, Austin?
It is, and it's only going to be up for a couple more days. So if you're a patron, get over there. If you're not a patron, make sure to sign up so you can get involved in that. But the poll is going to be closing soon so that we can announce the winner on the next episode.
And then you can also join the $5 tier where you get access to the polls voting for various sponsor or patron-sponsored episodes. But also you get the bonus episodes that we create. We just released recently a conversation between the two of us talking about the recent Black Mirror movie, Bandersnatch. And we'll also have a number of bonus episodes coming up. I think, Austin, you have one with Andy Stewart, the horror filmmaker, right? Coming up soon?
I do. Yep. It'll be out next week. So by the time this is out, it'll be out probably within a week. Yep.
Right. So you get access to all those bonus episodes and the polls, in addition to our monthly newsletter, which will also be coming out very soon.
It should be out by the time this episode is released.
Yeah.
Yeah. And now I'm going to steal Troy's job. And if you go to iTunes and you leave us a 5-star rating and a review, then you can ask us a question and we'll talk about it on air. Boom. That's all the admin shit. Let's go, brother. So, this is what we're going to get into now. It's time for the shitty minute. It is the moment of the podcast where one of us gets to rant and rave about whatever it is that has been pissing us off for the previous week or whatever. So, Troy, what is going on, man?
All right, so my shitty minute this week, I don't know that I'm so much pissed off about it as I'm just unnerved and uncomfortable with something that's happening in the social media sphere. And I wanted to get your take on it because I'm not sure if I really should be uncomfortable with it or how I should feel about it.
Okay.
So, you know this phenomenon where people who have a pretty large follower account on Twitter will have a bad experience with some like mega company, like an airline or a food service restaurant or some app or whatever, right? And then they tweet they sort of like, as a third party, just they name and shame, basically, the place. And like American Airlines, you gave me shitty service.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
And not even like, it's not even always like, hey, at American Airlines, you give me shitty service, you suck. It's usually like, it's in this like third person, I just happen to go on an American Airlines flight, and it was shitty. Too bad this happened. Unfortunately, I will not be giving them my services again. As if you're not even talking to them. You're just talking into the world, right? Like at the big other or whatever. Right. And it's obviously, this is a thing that's done because if someone has a large follower account, the various businesses will see this tweet, right? It gets lots of feedback, and they'll be worried about their reputation and the cost to their business in the future from people who are following this person, and then offer them something in return for a tweet saying they actually made up for it or whatever, right? And so only social media influencers or whatever, I hate that fucking term, do this thing. And it makes me feel really like icky. It's like it's very much the let me talk to your manager thing, and you yell it really loud so that the person has to do what you want. Otherwise, people will start leaving the place of business because they're like worried about this crazy person. It's exactly that, but done on the internet. And obviously, I think it's super obnoxious when people do that in person. And I guess it's less obnoxious on Twitter because you can just scroll past it. You don't necessarily want to leave because of it. But it seems icky, and it seems very much like you're forcing someone, like some poor like social media intern, to like grovel at your feet or whatever. It very much seems like that there's like grab for power. And that really unnerves me and makes me uncomfortable and feels icky, and I kind of hate that. But at the same time, I think about it for a minute, and I'm like, you know what? Maybe this person really did have a really shitty experience, and there's no way for them to get any recompense other than to do this. And so maybe that's okay, because in the relationship between this huge business and this one individual, no matter how many followers they might have, unless they're like a mega celebrity like Oprah or something, then the power relations are on the side of the business. So shouldn't I enjoy or be proud or sort of, affirm any instance where that giant source of power is brought down a peg? But somehow it doesn't do it for me. I don't really know what to think about it.
Do you think that it's the issue of performance that turns you off?
It definitely...
Because this is... Yeah.
No, go ahead.
No, yeah, because that's what it is. It's hard. How do I, like right now, you and I are talking to each other, but in a way, we're also performing for a third party, right? And there can be a tendency, at least I've noticed this in myself, and I want to make sure that I don't feed into this too much, but there can be a tendency to turn myself outward, so to speak, rather than engage with you. And I feel like Twitter does that so often. Like when you quote tweet somebody, that's what you're doing. You're kind of sharing with other people, but you're kind of performing. But a lot of times it can turn into just simple performance, where it's just I'm doing something and I'm shouting it outward rather than kind of like directing it towards people or kind of being authentic in like the directionality of my communication.
Yeah, I think it's definitely at an aesthetic level. That's for sure what's making me uncomfortable with it. But it doesn't seem like it's that shallow. There does seem to be something wrong with that in general. Certainly, I think it's wrong when someone does it in a public space. Because they're almost like using everybody else's attention as like a weapon. Like they're weaponizing other people's attention.
Oh, 100% they are.
Yeah, and that just seems... I just hate that. That just seems totally off. I think this is the solution, dude. Whenever someone gets to like 20,000 followers or whatever, they should just have their account deleted, and you have to start over again.
Oh no!
So basically,
is this your jubilee? This is like it's a jubilee.
Yeah, it's a jubilee of Twitter followers, and so like a reverse jubilee. You lose all of your No one gains followers this way, and so this is the thing, right? You can't stop the followers, so you can't just like cap your followers at 9,999 because someone else is gonna see something and then like follow you accidentally or whatever, or like your number of followers is only available to you or something. So it's like a top marginal tax rate of like 100%, right? No one actually ends up getting there. The closer you get to 20,000 asymptotally, you start blocking people, right?
Because you're gonna protect your account so that you stay right at 19,999
or as close as possible, right? So maybe then we have to like block even how many followers you have from you. So you don't even know when that's going to happen.
Ooh.
This is good.
Interesting.
This is a structural innovation that will help resolve this problem, I think.
This is like, you know how Black Mirror just does like critical and cynical takes on things. This would be a sort of like productive Black Mirror, like a positive Black Mirror. Like Black Mirror always only shows us the dystopian sides. Here's a way that we can sort of like manage the dystopianism of technology.
Yeah, and it would make the site totally unusable for mega celebrities. Like The Rock would get 20,000 followers in 30 seconds. So he would never actually get a Twitter account because he would have to keep defaulting back to 0 every 30 seconds.
Or do you think that there would be some strategy that someone would come up with that would utilize how to just recycle and have fresh followers every time. Because, you know, you're not always going to have the most engaged followers. You might just have like bots, or you might just have people that just want to follow you, but they're never going to really engage with you. But really, you want like engaged followers if you're trying to like use yourself as a brand. So you could just constantly like be recycling new followers.
Yeah, you know what? Nobody can have 20,000 friends.
It's just not possible.
You're
can't
not
allowed.
I mean,
you are not allowed.
We had tribes of 150. That's still about where we are in terms of the number of acquaintances you can have that you actually know anything about. So that's all you need, bruh.
You know what, man? People blame Mark Zuckerberg and shit like that. This is really all MySpace's fault. This is Tom's fault for MySpace. Fuck that guy, man.
Tom's like
Started
the
all this
shadowy
shit.
cabal, yeah, man. He was just a
I know.
picture. Who knows what Tom actually looks like?
No idea. Was that actually a picture of him?
I doubt it, man.
Yeah, who knows, right? Who knows?
It's like some Scooby-Doo shit. He's actually like a reverse Scooby-Doo shit. He's actually some monster underneath.
Probably. All right, so now we're going to jump into our main segment this week, and I'm stoked. I'm stoked because I have known of this man's moniker for years now, and I now realize that there's actually a name behind the moniker. It's John, a.k.a. TheLitCritGuy. What's up, John?
Hey, good to be on the show. Thank you so much for inviting me on. Very happy to be here.
Do you, like, know people for years, and they're like, by the way, what is your name?
Okay, well, there was this one thing that happened once. I was at a conference, and I was tweeting about it, and until the final panel of the day when I was going to be presenting a paper, and so I went up to the chair of the panel and I introduced myself, and they were like, "Hey, you're him, aren't you? You're him." And it's like, I didn't realize this, but they followed me on Twitter and realized that I was at this conference. And so all day they've been sitting with their friend like, he's here, but we've not seen him. He says he's presenting, but maybe that's a lot. So I was like, yes, yeah, that's me. I was like the world's most boring superhero.
I mean, I love it. It is a very on-the-nose superhero name.
Yeah, a little too on brand, I think, but I'm wedded to it now. If I were to change it and put my actual name on there, no one would know who I am.
That's right. No, I do love it. I mean, and I like the fact that there's the definite article. You're not just a LitCrit guy or LitCrit guy. You're the LitCrit guy.
That was it. All right. A somewhat embarrassing self-confession here. That is a combination of youthful arrogance and like back in the day, like 2011, 2012, I was a big fan of an internet reviewer called The Nostalgia Critic.
Okay.
And so he was like a big deal. And I was like, hey, well, that's what you do, right? You find a shtick and you put the definite article in the front of it. So I wasn't interested in nostalgia, but I was interested in. Man, I can't believe I told you that. That makes me sound just. Oh, I'm getting like secondhand self-embarrassment just listening to myself.
I mean, I'm inspired. I think we should change the podcast to The Owls at Dawn.
I was just thinking, would we double our listenership if we became The Owls at Dawn?
I'll say yes. I'll say definitely, almost certainly. There you go.
Perfect. Done and done. Well, cool. So we're really stoked to have you on. I mean, I'm actually one of those, like, probably one of those conference fanboys that I've known about you for quite a long time, prior to actually being able to engage with you. And it was because of our kind of work with Brett that you were able to kind of find. I think it was you had heard me, and then that's how you found Owls, was because I went on Rev Left, right?
Yeah, definitely. And shout out to Brett from Revolutionary Left Radio, who has done an amazing job of kind of like connecting this sort of emerging podcast culture scene to one another. Because, yeah, I never would have found Owls at Dawn if not for Rev Left.
I mean, that's how I found other like Dead Pundits. That's how I found Seriously Wrong. That's how I found so many other kind of like left people, philosophy types. So it's been a kind of, he's a lovely matchmaker.
He really is.
For a lot of us out
really
there. Yeah. Well, cool. So I guess as by way of introduction, if you wouldn't mind talking more about yourself in a in a self-aggrandizing way. Who are you? What do you do? What inspires you? What gave you the name LitCritGuy? And then tell people about your podcasts and your interests and kind of how it is that you kind of roam around this world.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a academic by training. I just finished a PhD in 2017 on the Gothic in the 19th century. And whilst I was in the process of finishing a master's degree, I started this Twitter account because I was like, hey, there's a lot of stuff that I've been reading that's kind of cool, and I don't think it's going to fit into any other venue. So I thought, hey, let's see if it will maybe pick up a few dozen other huge nerds out there. But it has kind of become the second half of what I do. So through the LitCritGuy, I try and talk a lot more about, specifically at the moment, Marxist theory and ways of viewing the intersections of politics and culture. I'm trying desperately to find the time to finish a book provisionally entitled Gothic Marxism. That was something that I was invited on to Rev Left to talk about. And
also the Antifada.
And the Antifada, another podcast I would not have found without hanging out with Brett. So once again, thank you, Brett. And so that's one of the strings to my bow, if you will, is talking about the ways in which the Gothic is useful as a mode of analysis for conceptualizing the operations of contemporary capitalism, and the way in which it is a material structure and process which can exert distinctly non-material influences and effects. What else do I do? I write. My PhD was on literature and theology in the Gothic, and I'm working on a book which will be one of those academic books that very few people will read. And but it's a fun way of spending some time. At the moment, I kind of exist in a sort of para-academic role, which means I've sort of been thinking quite a lot about what does it mean to actually be an academic and try and do publicly engaging intellectual work. So I spend a lot of time talking to very kind people who will invite me on their podcasts. Over at Rev Left, I've been on 3 times. Once to talk about Gothic Marxism, once to talk about Mark Fisher's landmark pamphlet, Capitalist Realism, and once recently, as a kind of follow-up to the episode that you did, Austin, to talk about Jameson's postmodernism, the cultural logic of late capitalism. And after a conversation with a friend, we decided that you know what the world needed, what Left Twitter needed, we needed another podcast. So we're like, you know what, that's the gap in the market here, guys. So we started a new show called Horror Vanguard, which is a combination of the spookiest film culture and rigorous anti-capitalist theory. So we just released an episode on John Carpenter's Halloween and the horrors of suburbia. We did a really fun episode just before Christmas on Gremlins as a film on the ethics of Marxist revolution and violence, which was a lot of fun to talk about. And we've got some very exciting plans for Horror Vanguard coming up. So that is me. What I'm interested in is Marxism, culture, politics, and theology. So the big four, the big four.
Yeah, Gothic horror, leftist politics, and theology, that's some intersectionality that I can get behind.
Yeah. So when you say horror, do you mean like are you trying to sneak in the back door and say that there's something super important intellectually or conceptually about horror as like either a supplement or some sort of like constitutive power to analyzing culture? Or do you just sometimes sit back and say, I just want to watch fucking Halloween because I think there's something fascinating about it? Or is it like some sort of hybrid between the two?
Yeah, I mean, those two things are not mutually contradictory, right? I mean, we can.
Right.
I mean, I think one of the ways that horror is useful is because it articulates the anxieties of the culture within which it was produced. That's what it. Even if that, there are some critics who are a little bit sort of high-handed about it and go, "Oh no, horror's job is not to articulate anxieties; it's to be scary." But things are scary, and things find cultural resonance because of a particular set of operational discourses which construct the ideological totality of a particular historical moment. So I think there's no contradiction there. Like, horror films are fun and exciting, and they are also deeply informative about who we are, where we are culturally speaking, what we find to be unsettling, and more importantly, why we find those things to be unsettling.
So I've got one of my best friends around the world. He's a guy named Andy Stewart. He's a film director, and I've worked with him on a bunch of different projects. And he is going to be doing a bonus episode with us, and we actually just recorded it, so it'll be out probably within a week after this one drops. And he's obsessed with body horror in particular, right? David Cronenberg type of stuff, but also the old, like, the Incredible Melting Man and Street Trash and Society and a lot of these older, like, B kind of, or not even B, Z body horror films. And his films
Society is
been
a personal favorite. Society's amazing.
Oh, Society's
film.
great. It's great. I love Zizek's take on that too, where it's like, this is literally how the capitalist people are. They're just literally feeding off of the poor, right?
This is what rich people really do.
This
It's
is
a
what they
metaphor,
really
but
do.
it's also true.
Yeah, exactly.
Wait, what is this movie? What is this movie?
You've not seen it, Troy?
What's it called?
Society?
I don't think I've seen it. It's like a 70s film?
80s, I think. And it 80s? Is it 80s? Yeah, it's got to be 80s. And it is basically
1989.
Okay, it's this like really rich suburban neighborhood where things kind of go a little weird with how it is that they how they interact with people who are of a lower standing than themselves. You have to see it, bro. It's fucking wild.
The last
for sure, yeah.
The last 30 minutes is maybe just it's literally jaw dropping. The less you know about it, the better. Watch Society. It's so good.
It is so good. It's so good. But what you said just a minute ago about like horror sort of indicating a lot of the anxieties of a given culture that's articulating these particular horror motifs is exactly what Andy says. Now, Andy's not a philosopher. He's educated and he reads a lot, and he has a tremendous political sensibility. But it's all from just kind of growing up, and then in particular his interests in art. And obviously he went to school and shit like that. But really, it's his interest in body horror that I found so fascinating, because one of the things he discussed is his interest in it is because of his own anxieties about his body, and so by kind of being fascinated by the body, and when you have like a weird growth on your body, or when you have a cut, or when you have some sort of weird thing that's going on inside of your body, and you start to like do some research on the internet, which you should never do, but you start looking at like weird tumors and things like that, and you're like, what the fuck? Like, the body is so strange. But it's his interest in exploring, and his interest in watching horror, and his interest in making horror films is partly because he's interested in exploring this mystery, or this beyond, or this something, this uncanny thing. And I think there's something super fascinating about that, and how it kind of stimulates thought.
Yeah, totally.
Well, cool. So I think this week we kind of were like, well, what is it that we really want to nail down? And I think one of the things that would unite the three of us, coming from our each individual perspectives, is the idea of, for lack of a better term, of robust materialism versus like a crude or a bland materialism. So we're going to kind of talk about what is materialism, what is a crude materialism, what are some of the deficiencies with a crude materialism, and then why would we want to articulate like a more robust materialism. And I think this fits in with a lot of your work, John, because I think that it seems, at least, that a lot of your interest in theology and literature is kind of a way of looking at the tracings or the hauntings or the specters that are beyond just like the physical world. And it seems that so much, particularly of progressive or left politics, is in trying to be rigorously quote-unquote materialist, they're obsessed with a sort of like radically reductive understanding of the world. And personally, I think that leads to a very limited and limiting orientation to politics and to life in general. And so I figured we should kind of delve into that. Does that sound about right, guys?
Yeah, that sounds exciting.
Yep.
I'm in. Let's do it.
Cool. So I guess first, what the fuck is materialism? Yeah.
Well, should we go back to Democritus? I mean, how far back do we want to go?
Yeah.
Let's just go with like very simple broad strokes. What do you think, Troy?
I guess we could talk about sort of the more popular understanding today, right? I mean, not materialism in the more ethical sense in terms of like consumerist materialism, like Madonna-style materialism.
Right.
But stemming from like Hobbes, and that kind of understanding, I would think that most of the philosophical kinds of materialism that exist today in their various strands, whether in analytic philosophy in the scientific domain or following a more continental direction in like the Marxist domain, kind of have their roots in some respect to Hobbes, right?
Okay. So could you say more about that?
Yes, I mean, the basic idea in Hobbes in the early chapters of Leviathan is that he wants to be able to explain via like an empiricist orientation towards the world how the movement of physical bodies can explain how and why everything is. That's a pretty simple definition of materialism, right?
Okay. So it's basically trying to scrape away any sort of transcendence or any sort of otherworldly, supernatural, we might say, influences or powers on the world that kind of guide things. But rather, we can understand the world as it is by looking at the things that are in front of us, by examining people and the structures that they build and the institutions that they build here in this world, in the here and now. Yeah.
Right. So one part of it's the orientation that tries to erase the supernatural, right? But it's not even just the supernatural, because you also have to include things like ideas and thoughts as being sort of, for Hobbes, physical things. You can explain them physically, he thinks, and so there's no reason to posit any sort of non-physical or non-material essence that's like mystical or impossible to perceive or whatever. And so most people, I don't think, would consider ideas supernatural. So that's kind of like a one point where we have to distinguish materialism from like anti-supernaturalism or something.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, and maybe a good way of kind of covering these just in those like few things that you've said. There's already so many different things that emerge out of it. So maybe it's better to talk about materialisms in the plural rather than a kind of singular conception of what materialism is. But to kind of, if you ask me to kind of give a very broad strokes, horribly reductionist answer, I think most people would intuitively respond something on the lines of like, physical stuff is all the stuff that there is. So we reject the problems of mind-body interactionism, which you go all the way back to Descartes, if not further, and go, no, the only things that exist is physical stuff. That's the only kind of matter that there is. And it's from there that I think lots of people would accept as a kind of intuitive, very broad reductionist conception of what materialism is.
Right, and even in sort of analytic philosophy of mind today, it seems like the debate is not so much centered around whether or not physical stuff is all there is, since that's a really difficult claim to make and to justify, but to say instead that physical stuff is the only stuff that has causal power in the world. Yeah. So whether or not there is non-physical stuff just really ultimately doesn't matter in the sense that you can explain everything through physical interaction because only physical stuff has causal power over anything else.
Again, which avoids that problem of interactionism, right? How does something that's purely non-physical actually do anything?
What do they say about imaginary objects like Santa Claus that force people to wake up in the morning? Do they just reduce that to like chemical processes, and that there's clearly something going on in the brain that can explain these imaginative stories that make people wake up every single year and build systems of mythology?
I mean, yeah, if you want to get into like the philosophy of language, like what's referred to when you refer to Santa Claus, I don't even want to get into that bullshit. It's like the biggest waste of time in philosophy. But Yeah, I mean, it seems like you could easily say that there doesn't have to necessarily be a physical Santa Claus to cause a belief in you that there is a Santa Claus, which then forms intentions and actions and behaviors and whatnot. I mean, we all know that there's imaginary things that can have causal power in some sense. It's just about trying to figure out, well, it's not the imaginary thing that's doing it.
Right.
So there has to be something to which that imaginary thing is identical to, which is, or reducible to, that is physical.
And then they go to like neuroscience or some shit like that to try to justify it, probably.
But yeah, once you have that claim, then you can always find ways to rationalize some sort of position, right?
Right. So then, okay, so if that's kind of like a very simple way of kind of explaining materialism in broad strokes, what are some divisions within materialism that we would find inherently limiting? Like, and I'm thinking particularly of what I called earlier, like a crude materialism. And it kind of maybe would go to some of these tendencies that Troy was just discussing now, where let's reduce everything to, biological cause effect, or let's reduce everything to that which is scientifically verifiable, or something along those lines. I'm thinking maybe like of the new atheist fad that came in, that really seems to have a larger impact than I ever thought. The more that I talk with people, they're like, man, I really had a new atheist phase. And I'm like, Jesus, like, I feel like everybody did except for me, Well,
here's a question that has to do with that, because we've been talking about the more Anglo-American, scientistic conception of materialism. And that's clearly, in some ways, importantly different from the more continental orientation that has like a Marxist flavor to it. And the big difference there, I would think, is the idea of relations. So we're talking about, for the scientific domain, physical things have causal powers, right? Well, causation is a relation between two things, right? Mm-hmm. X causes Y. You have to have two things to have causation, unless you get into like some weird self-causing thing. But I guess then X causes X. So if you need two things to have a causal relation, what is the relation? Because that's not really a physical thing, right? But in some sense it exists. And it seems like the more continental Marxist orientation is very willing to incorporate relations into the material world, because obviously relations of power and relations of base and superstructure and between different classes and stuff are all extremely important for explaining sort of the Marxist interpretation of things. But it seems like that's a harder thing to incorporate into the more scientific Anglo-American, at least the philosophical domain, because relations don't seem to be physical things.
Yeah, and of course, I think another important kind of strain to a sort of more Marxist materialism is the relation of the subject to the world, or to put it in kind of more broad terms, nature and culture. Right, that's the big kind of Marxist materialist sort of axiom that you begin from, and maybe we can get into that a little further down the line. But I think that maybe is, I would agree that that's probably the point at which you suddenly go, oh, we're maybe running into some philosophical problems here that have to be mapped out more carefully.
My mind automatically is going to Bruno Latour as somebody who would be the foil to that division between nature culture, who wrote the book, We Have Never Been Modern. Mm-hmm. And his whole point is that this nature culture divide is sort of a fabricated bifurcation that doesn't really obtain. It doesn't really have the purchase that people seem to think it had, and it actually leads us down a sort of dangerous path, intellectually speaking.
Yeah,
and
go on.
No, yeah, that's it.
I was just going to say that, he talks about this in his book on Gaia, where he's talking about the relationship of humans to the ongoing climate catastrophe that we've seen. And you read the first lecture, and he's desperately trying to undo this binary, which I also think is something that you can undo from a Marxist point of view if you kind of reevaluate exactly what the subject is, whether we are the agent that stands outside of nature, or if, as someone like Terry Eagleton would argue a couple of years ago in his book on materialism, that we are in fact, bound up within a specific iteration of a specific variant of matter, which is we are a specific kind of animal that acts in specific ways, and it's the acting which is also important, that because that often gets glossed over. One of the problems I think that you run into with actor network theory with Latour, although there are kind of attempts now emerging to address this, is the problem of responsibility. If all matter has agency, then where do you get any kind of responsibility from?
Yeah.
I think that's a really good point, and that kind of brings up to mind for me the polar opposites that we've been discussing here, right? A sort of crude version of the Anglo-American orientation is that there is only the world and there aren't really any subjects, right? This is the reductive explanation that everything following Hobbes is just physical objects moving each other around, and so there's no room for any sort of responsibility or even genuine action in that.
Everything comes down to physics almost, right? Everything comes down to the motion of particles into one another.
Yeah, and I love that Galen Strawson, who's a analytic philosopher at the University of Texas, he calls this physicscalism. I think that's how you say it.
Yes.
So he differentiates physicalism, which is just the position that only physical things exist, to physicsalism, which is the idea that our current physics is the only thing or the sort of the elements described by our current physics are the only things that exist. And that really gets to the idea of how impossibly optimistic you'd have to be to really accept that as interpreting the entirety of the world. So that's on one side, right? And then the other side, we have this more crude continentalist orientation where it's just the subject and the subject creates the world. Like maybe a really crude Kantianism or whatever.
Yeah.
And that's both of those are extremely problematic, right? And John, you're mentioning Eagleton, and it seems to me that what that sort of correction is trying to do is to introduce like a dialectical relationship between subject and world.
Yeah.
So that world affects subject and constitutes subject, but then subject can also act and constitute world.
Yeah, precisely. And I think I actually think Eagleton's approach is maybe more, because if we can kind of sketch out the schema here, you go, well, the problem is, as you put it, that you reduce everything to just the subject, and the subject is a kind of monad without a world to inhabit. Or you go, well, there is no subject, and neither of those seem particularly sort of satisfying. And again, I also think that there are problems with going that either like all matter has agency as a way of getting rid of the kind of necessity for non-materiality, for dualism or any other kind of way around that problem. That kind of vitalist materialism, which has a very long tradition with people like Spinoza. But I also think there is something that is very interesting in the Marxist tradition, where you go, the important thing about the human animal is that it acts and behaves in certain ways. And that is not just something that is produced, but it's something that affects the environment which we inhabit. So there is absolutely this dialectical relationship between the subject and the world, or between nature and culture, which means we really shouldn't consider them as being oppositional or a binary, which again, perhaps we can get onto more in more detail in a little while.
I mean, I think one of the things that I find so interesting about this is John, you mentioned the issue of responsibility. It seems to me that one of the integral components of like a Marxist materialism or some form of dialectical or historical materialism is precisely to deal with that issue of complicity and then maybe responsibility insofar as we are creating and recreating the worlds that we inhabit. So the idea of being thrown into conditions that are not of our own choosing, it isn't just that like Newtonian space exists and we are like thrown into it and then we kind of emerge, but rather it's this radical co-constitutive productivity between bodies that we end up calling subjects and non-human bodies that we could call institutions, or that we can call buildings, or that we can call rooms, or that we can call other people, or whatever. I mean, there are these swirling kind of fields that kind of all contaminate one another in their co-constitutive relations. And this seems to me to be so important to understand if we are going to understand a materialism that doesn't fall into that sort of crude reductionism that we seem to be kind of criticizing here.
Yeah, I think to say that we are materialists is not to say that human beings are the same as bed frames and wardrobes. To say that that we are material beings is not to say that we are the same kind of material. So there is a way of kind of, it isn't necessarily being reductionist or not valuing sort of humans subjects correctly or enough. If anything, I think it allows for a kind of realistic assessment of the world as it is, trying to get away from the kind of continentalist fondness for idealism, or even the kind of more analytic fondness for a sort of a universe of thought experiments which is actually disconnected from the material world in so many ways. So I think to say that you're a Marxist materialist is to accept that what we are is material stuff, but what we are is not the same kind of material stuff as everything else. But we are inextricably bound up within it. There's a Simon Critchley talks about this, that our kind of fundamental ontological condition is to be in debt to one another. We're born, we're thrown into the world, utterly dependent upon people that we did not choose to be dependent upon. And so it's in our nature to be constituted by those not just, we don't just absorb the sensuous world as Marx would write, sensuality the sensuous objects can be produced from us as well.
Yeah. This is one of the things I think that's interesting too, is I like how you kind of just threw a little shade at Marx there. One of the things I think that's so important for especially people that are like just finding socialist politics, or they're just being introduced to Marx, is I've been overwhelmed lately with the idea of like killing my darlings and like killing my heroes. And I think it's, I was like overwhelmed recently. I was walking home from the office and I was thinking to myself about like how like Hegel could be really, really fucking wrong, and how the entire history of thought up until like relatively recently, in the West at least, was really written by people who had access to education, which really limited a great vast of the population, which means that the ideas that we have been offered aren't necessarily always the best ideas that ever could have been. They may be the best ideas that have been handed down to us, but they're not necessarily the best ideas that ever could have been, which means that there is a radical contingency that we need to kind of take into our interpretations of people. And that just because Hegel says something that we don't understand, that doesn't mean that he has access to some secret wisdom that we then must beat ourselves up over because we don't get it. Now, it could be the case that we just don't understand, but we also need to recognize that maybe the dude was fucking struggling with the limits of language just like we are today.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the same goes with Marx. I think that so much of Marx is obviously extremely important, but I also think there's a lot in Marx that is really limiting, and particularly the nature-culture divide in particular is one where I think where Marx is radically insufficient.
This is an important. I think this is an important point, especially for people who are interested in kind of the Marxist tradition in socialist politics, which is there's a great essay from the early 1920s by Lukács, where the opening paragraph talks about what would happen if everything that Marx wrote was proven to be wrong. What would happen if, and he says nothing would change. Nothing would need to change, because Marxism is not dogma. It is not holy writ. It's not scripture. Marxism is a method, and that method is dialectical materialism. So as material conditions change, as new knowledge emerges, as new opportunities for knowledge emerge, because I think the point you made there about access and availability of knowledge is incredibly important, then of course things that we once thought to be true will be proven to be limited or to be false. But that doesn't eliminate the value that they may hold, right? So
exactly,
if we are interested in a kind of emancipatory politics of any stripe, then surely the important thing to do is recognize the intellectual necessity of keeping what is good from the past, being willing to let go of what does not work, and being prepared to practice the formation and implementation of new concepts, of new and because it's that implementation, that combination of theoretical intellectual work with doing, with an active action in the world, is the core of what any kind of serious, philosophically rigorous Marxist materialism should be about.
Now, I don't know if you guys agree with this, but I love what you just said about the idea of new concepts, because I have been extremely influenced by the work of Gilles Deleuze, who in What is Philosophy discusses how he and Guattari talk about how what is philosophy? It's the creation of concepts, right? But one of the ways that we can look at one of the central concerns for Deleuze is the idea of trying to radically think the novel. And you find this as well in guys like Alain Badiou, my work on Sartre. It's this idea of how is it that we can think the novel, and I don't mean like the book, the novel, I mean the new, for listeners. But then more recently, someone like Catherine Malibu has written about this with regards to like the brain and plasticity. And I think that the stakes of having a sort of robust materialism really circle around this question, because for me, it seems that analytical thought, the physicsalism that Galen Strawson talks about, maybe, it doesn't allow for genuine novelty to really emerge, because truth under that paradigm of thought is about certainty. It's not about process. Whereas, even though the Deleuzians would not like this idea, maybe in the way that I'm going to frame it, but the idea that, for Hegel, the idea that truth is different from certainty because truth is process is something that I think is so important, which means that, in the process, I was just telling you guys before we started recording, I was listening to a couple of guys talk about the preface to Phenomenology of Spirit on the podcast Y Theory, Todd McGowan, who I've talked about on the podcast before. But one of the things that they talk about is, like, when you get to absolute knowing in Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, what you end up finding out that absolute knowing is that you don't actually have certainty about knowledge, but that there is sort of like contradiction and disruption, or this sort of idea of like being torn asunder that is embedded within truth itself. And for me, it's the idea, rather than kind of where like analytic thought and scientific orientations and a lot of other sort of materialist orientations want to broaden out their scope. They want to know more by adding, let's say, outwards, to use a spatial metaphor. The sort of Hegelian and more robust materialist orientation that I'm interested in is kind of going inwards and going deeper rather than broadening out the spectrum. And I think that would be the difference between Hegel's bad infinite and sort of like absolute infinity. The bad infinite is you can just keep sequentially adding numbers, for example, and you keep getting bigger and bigger. But that's not really what a truly robust materialism would be concerned with. It would be about kind of like going inwards and expanding and almost exploding, if you will, or not exploding, maybe imploding, or I don't even know what the word would be, but it would be something about going deeper down, maybe fractally. And that's where like the Deleuzian ideas start to become interesting to me. Does that make sense at all, with kind of like trying to think about maybe some of the problems with a crude materialism versus more a robust materialism, and then how that can like impinge on this notion of novelty?
So let me ask a question here, because it's something that kind of bugs me a bit, and I'm not really sure what I think about it whenever we talk about these kinds of things. By including people like Hegel and Deleuze talking about materialism, the question might come in and say, at what point do we just say materialism isn't really even a thing? Because at what point do we even have some sort of definition of what counts as being material? Especially if we're including someone like Hegel.
Yeah, or like Deleuze, who's, like John was saying earlier, is going to come out of that Spinozist, vitalist tradition. Yeah.
I mean, is there a point where just material just means whatever you want it to mean?
John, what you think?
I mean, I sort of see the point, but I think this maybe circles back around to the problem of limitations of language, right? I think that's probably a big part of this. And also one of the problems that we kind of run into is the instrumentalizing of the material world, right? If we kind of, and I think maybe that's maybe the issue with a very strictly scientific materialism, is that it all too easily slips into a kind of crude instrumentalism, where we go, well, these are the things that happen, and they happen for these ends, as a way of kind of explaining everything, and that isn't that quickly leaves the realm of physics and slides into a fairly repressive politics, and that's something that you can actually happen with somebody like Steven Pinker or with Richard Dawkins, who begin with this very scientific approach, and it becomes a very instrumentalized approach to material existence. But as to whether it does materialism lack any meaning, I think its capacity and its capacious flexibility is also, yes, a problem, but also an opportunity. It's an opportunity to rethink, and we can say, well, we don't know what we're talking about then, but that's a fairly good admission to actually not end the kind of philosophical inquiry, right? That's the point at which we go, okay, then I think we're actually trying to get somewhere that might be significant.
No, I think you're totally right about that, and that's kind of, I would hesitate to call myself a materialist just because it seems to me that materialism is more of a corrective term than it is a like substantive term. And so it's really when someone's being insufficiently materialist, you can then come in and point that out as a corrective term. And you can do that with the scientific Anglo-American orientation as much as you can do that with more crude, vulgar Marxist orientations. And I mean, I have my own tendentious reasons for thinking this way, but I tend to think of materialism mainly being about the contingency of things. And that seems to me to be also more of a corrective term. And many different philosophical orientations tend to erase the contingency of things, whether it be objects or structures or ways of being or whatever it is. And a sort of sufficient materialism would be the one that comes in and shows that actually these objects or institutions or relations or whatever are actually more contingent than your theory allows for.
Yes, and I love that, because I think that socialism is also a corrective term and not a substantive term. And I know that's going to get me in trouble with some people, but I think that this is where I have some of the problems with current debates around like identity politics versus like what's sometimes referred to as like class first or class reductionism, is that the democratic socialist or social democrat movement in America and the UK right now seems to be substantive in its orientation, whereas I think that Marxist socialism is essentially a sort of negative differential correction to the logic of capitalism, rather than necessarily offering a substantive. Now, this is what we're kind of working through in the Cohen book, is I think Cohen kind of senses this a little bit and says, well, then let's introduce some sort of normative theory into this, and then we can have some sort of substantive claims. I think that ultimately Cohen kind of runs into some problems as well, but I think that what he's trying to do is I think he's sensing something at the ontological level that I think is really important to understand. What do you think about that? Do you think that maps onto it? I mean, in a way, is that why Marx, as a historical materialist, dialectical materialist, however we want to classify him, is kind of articulating his critique of the political economy? And that's what we need to remember, is that he even says that all the critique begins with the critique of religion, and then he writes the critique of political economy. So he's always distancing himself. It's always a correction to. It's this negative differential from the thing that he is that is like initiating his entire methodology. Is that too reductive, you think, to say that about socialism?
So there's a couple of things that I would probably want to highlight. And firstly, to talk about contingency just for a second. And there aren't very many sort of full-blooded dialectical materialists around anymore. They are a rare breed. But if you read something like Engels on the dialectics of nature, there are these kind of beautiful passages talking about the natural world, its consistent change, its constant motion, and you get this kind of very capacious vision of existence as almost always on the cusp of turning into something else, of almost always becoming that which it isn't, of almost always just becoming, I suppose, to return to that sort of Deleuzean Spinozist line. But dialectics of nature, for example, is a great work on the very contingency of existence. And as to whether socialism is a corrective, perhaps I would maybe try and nuance that a bit by looking at Marx as a theorist of processes, right? And I think a lot of the problems that we have with materialism and just on a kind of basic conceptual level is that we're often very drawn to thinking about materialism as a kind of static. Material objects are often on the intellectual plane when we think about them, often appear as static, as coherent, as no longer in motion. But capital, for example, is about the laws of motion, the processes, the constant changes and shifts of capitalism, precisely with that point in mind, to drive home the fact that no, the extraction of surplus value, the vicious alienation of the subject from themselves and from their communities is not immutable. It is not a law of the universe. It is a precise historical and contingent configuration of the social totality, and it's less correction and more cure for this. It is the next. It is the shift that is coming. Is socialism. Is a new way of arranging our economic and social forces. Why? Because we can. Because there is the iron laws of capitalism are paper tigers. They can change. They are not immutable. Capitalism itself is contingent, and we've seen this. We've seen the colossal efforts institutions will go to hide and obscure that fact. You simply have to go back to 2008, and we will see it again when the next financial crisis emerges, probably coupled with an ecological catastrophe. You'll see the huge amount of resources that will be marshaled to defend the contingency of capitalism. So I think, contingency is absolutely something that a more Marxist, more socialist interpretation of materialism can encompass without falling to pieces. And I think, can we talk about socialism as the cure, as the higher gear, as the next level, as it were, rather than as just the corrective?
Yeah, and here's the thing that I think is so interesting, and this is something that really is important in my thought, and I would imagine in both of yours too, especially with all of our interests in theology at some point in our lives, whether it's ongoing or whatever, is what happens after socialism, right? So, and I don't mean what happens the day after the revolution in the way that so many people articulate it, but I feel like there's a real myopia in so much of materialist political thinking that thinks that socialism is somehow going to be the resolution and introduction of harmony of everything, right? Mm-hmm. And that there will be no more depression, right? I know you worked with Brett on going through Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism. One of the things that he talked about was the relationship between capitalist exploitation and mental health, right? Mm-hmm. And I know it seems as though a lot of people who are leftist thinkers think that somehow all of the contradictions of capital will be overcome and we will reach this like stoic state of contentment, right? Like peace of mind will exist because economic modalities will be equitable. And one of the things that I think is so important to understand is that when I think of socialism as a corrective, I sort of mean it in that sense. It is, like you just said, John, the next stage. But there will be other stages after. I mean, assuming that we don't all die in a heat death or that humanity just becomes extinct, right?
We're optimistic, Austin.
Right, no. Theoretically, there will be further stages. But there is no end of history, right? There is no... If the dialectic is a way of kind of articulating this notion of process or becoming, then that means that there will be subsequent stages. There will be subsequent problems. There will be problems that let's say full communism is globally instituted tomorrow, 100 years from now, whatever. It's not that somehow is going to just alleviate all problems. There will be other issues of allocation of resources and roles and ethnicity and tradition, and someone is going to discover some old book that's going to reintroduce some ideas, and they're going to start some sort of like movement that'll be viewed as a cult, but maybe it'll really be like this really cool idea, but they're going to be like these crazy outcasts. Something's going to happen that's going to cause these internal disruptions, because that seems to be some sort of constant, even in a world of contingency, right? Maybe that's some sort of necessity in this world of contingency. And so what I wonder is, how can we think that? How can we allow for our thought to think that, but politically today in a way where we can still be committed to like a leftist politics, an anti-capitalist politics, but that isn't like stifling? Because I just feel like so much of leftist political discourse is stifling, and that it doesn't allow for anything else, and it's so rigid in its like teleological orientation.
I was just going to say, Austin, before we get into that political question,
Yeah.
can we say then that this robust materialism we're talking about, avoiding the twin pitfalls of the different kinds of reductive materialism, is it anti-teleological? Is that what we're saying with this?
I think
if
it
it's
has
going
to
to be sufficiently, if it's going to be sufficiently admitting of contingency at every level, then it seems to me that it kind of has to be anti-teleological.
I 100% think it has to be. John?
Yeah, totally.
Yes. Yeah. 100%.
Yeah, that seems to me to be a huge reason, or a huge problem in both the scientific domain, where the teleology is more about sort of like a hard determinism, as well as in the like vulgar Marxist domain. We've been talking about, reading the Cohen book, the idea of the obstetric metaphor, which has a teleology baked into it, where socialism is the sort of natural and necessary outgrowth of the contradictions of capitalism.
Yeah, and I don't even think it's always conscious. Like I know I've mentioned this before, but it's been something that's really been like weighing on my heart quite heavily lately. With regards to like sort of stuff that's going on in the UK and the US, but particularly in the US, it seems to be more potent. But the debate between like identity politics and class identity or class reduction or whatever. But identity politics is an easy punching bag for people who are Marxists, and so I don't want to add too much to that debate, or to that side of the debate anyway. But where I actually am critical is that I think that a lot of these class reductionists, like the Adolf Reed types, and as much as I love them, like the guys on Dead Pundits, kind of talk about this, and I think they fall into this trap a lot of times. And I think sometimes what can end up happening is it can lead to a different type of like vulgar identity, but I referred to it, I think, in the last episode when Troy and I were talking, not as a class reduction, but as a class restriction or a class restrictivism. This is what class is. Class is identified in a particular way. And that seems to me to be a sort of epiphenomenon of a methodological problem, which is this idea of a teleological form of thinking. And it's this idea of not being able to really understand process. It's not being able to really understand contingency. It's not being able to really understand a robust materialism beyond what I think is actually a strange sort of positivist and analytical type of materialism that really ends up being a sort of like relativistic, analytical, instrumental, kind of technological form of reason. And I think that to really have a robust materialism, we have to try to think beyond that. We have to think more than that. What does that mean? I mean, I don't know. Hopefully we can hash that out. But I think we have to be committed to something that is beyond that. Does that make any sense? I know that's super abstract. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this kind of circles back around a bit to this question of what is material. It seems like it has a lot less to do with whether something's physical, and a lot more to do with whether something is involved in like contingent relations with other things, and doesn't have a telos and all that kind of stuff. And it's like, strangely, almost like ironically, materialism is not a whole lot about being physical.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And I think one of the things I would say, and I sort of agree with the sort of line of argument you're making there, Austin, is that there is a degree to which that kind of banal class restrictionism is insufficiently materialist, right?
Yes.
It's turning
Yeah.
it's turning Marx into dogma again, which we've been warned for nearly 100 years not to do, and it's also failing to account for the extent to which the existence of capitalism conditions our imaginations. And
Yes.
one of the things I'm fascinated by is the potential for a kind of materialist understanding of the imagination, because you make a really good point there. Like, what is going to happen under socialism? And uh, one of the things I sort of tweeted out a little while ago is a quote from Eagleton's um, book in praise of essay in praise of Marx, where he says that one of the best reasons for being a socialist is that you hate going to work. But there's a big joke wrapped, hiding within it a very serious point, right? That labor is not just what we do, not just what we exchange in order to get our subsistence. It isn't just what we do to survive. It's something that conditions us as subjects. And one of the things that I think is so important for a good, um, robust materialism is to accept that those contingent relations are historical, right? We are connected to a great chain of radical struggle. And it's that radical struggle, that dream of a better world, that maybe for generations, for centuries even, never arrived, that has been handed down in these physical objects, in these PDF files, in these speeches, in these books, in these groups that have arrived with us. And I think if one of the ways to kind of critique that class reductionism, that class restrictionism, is to one, make the point that they are being insufficiently materialist, and to also, they're not paying attention to the world as it really is, and also they have a distinct lack of imagination, right?
Yes.
They are
Yes.
they are still existing within a very grey capitalist realist horizon, that really the socialist revolution will bring about a world which is pretty much the same as this one. No, like, do we not dare dream slightly bigger? Is our and of course that will still result in tensions, in even sadness and melancholy and misery and sometimes pain. But what won't be there will be the systemic restrictions and affective pains which intensify all of that, which is what comes from living under capitalism. So I absolutely agree that maybe materialism does not have much to do with physical objects, but to do with, I think that's actually quite a moving phrase, this contingent relationships. And those are historical chains. They stretch backwards, sometimes centuries, but also we have the potential to pass them forward too.
So I love this, because actually this is literally exactly what my book is about. Because this is, I think, the thing that Sartre is addressing in Critique of Dialectical Reason is precisely this issue. He's looking at both the dialectics of nature, and he's looking at what he calls like positivist or analytical Marxism, and he's saying that neither of them are sufficiently dialectical. And so he wants to then kind of articulate a new path to what does it mean to actually ground dialectical reason. He says that Marxism does not have a ground as of now, and he's writing this in the late 50s, published in 1960. And he says that we need to try to investigate the ground, if you will, of being, and then to validate the unveiling of this grounding of being. And that's exactly what he's interested in. And I think that he is always a thinker of the imagination, and his early work was on investigations into the imagination. And for me, one of the things is I want to revel in the powers of the imagination, whereas so much of materialist thought is afraid of the imagination because it's utopian, as they might say. And there has to be a way to navigate between those two, right? Between wanting to be committed to thinking, like you just said, think more. Like, let's think bigger. Let's think beyond. Let's think wildly about what the future might be. But then at the same time, let's not be naive, and let's not be rigid or dogmatic in our imaginative orientations. And I think that's the issue for me. It isn't how big our imaginations are or how wild our speculations are that's the issue. It's how dogmatic and rigid we are when we do that. That is the issue.
I mean, I think this is nicely summed up in a very famous axiom from Gramsci. You know, the pessimism of the intellect. We have to be rigorous. We have to be willing. We have to be willing to look at the world as it really is. We have to know exactly. We have to know exactly how bad things are, and we have to do that unsparingly. We can't hide from it. But at the same time, pessimism of the intellect. But at the same time, and this is actually a very hard thing to do. At the same time, hold with it the optimism of the will that states that the world as it is, the world in all of its exploitation, of its violence, of its systemic injustice, the world as it is can be radically transformed into something that potentially we can't even fully articulate at the moment. And I think that it's very easy to say that we're dialectical, but to put that into practice is the very hard work of thinking.
What do you say about people that are like that the rejoinder would be like, okay, yeah, great. You know, have grand thoughts and stuff like that, but you have to deal with the world as it is. And I know that you just mentioned that's like the two poles, but they would say no, like you're still being fanciful. You know, like that's not the way the world is. The world has physical limits, and there are laws of nature, and there are, you know, real institutional pressures that are imposed upon us. Like, how do we address that? How do you say, how do we kind of navigate between those two poles?
Wow, give me the easy one. Yeah, give me the easy question. Well, I think there are a couple of, well, really, there's one thing. There is the thing that we have, the thing that we've always had, which is solidarity in all of its forms, right? What do we have with us that is the catalyst, the potential um, to remake the world around us, and that's one another, and that isn't a naive or utopian thing, right? That isn't.
Hmm.
It is concrete. It isn't just a case of going, oh, you're being a utopian, you're dreaming of what life could be like out in the future. No, solidarity is a material practice that is enacted here and now, right? It is not just what we dream of and what we theorize about, but it is something that we do collectively together. And that is also another way that we could think about um, materialism, is that Marx says, I can't remember where he talks about this, but he talks about thought proceeding from the abstract up towards the concrete, right? And normally we would think that things would operate the other way around, where you go, oh well, you start with observation and you go out to an abstract theory. But Marx says, actually, no. What we have is we have kind of our abstract conceptions. We have these kind of, but then we have to go out into the world, and we will find that the world is far more complicated and maybe stranger and less comprehensible than we thought. So thought actually gets more complicated when you engage with concrete material reality. But yeah, what I would say is maybe the thing that we have at hand is the practice, the material doing of solidarity with one another, and that involves very small, mundane things quite often. Um, One of the things that I am sort of so glad to see happening is something like bail funds, right? How do you abolish prisons? Well, you can have the kind of grand abolitionist theories of justice, but you also have to have practical ways of getting people out of prison now. And you do that. Community bail funds are an incredible example of what does the material practice of solidarity look like as a way of not only remedying immediate injustice that is at hand, but also opening the possibility for people to see a potential future where not only are their loved ones or their community in prison, but nobody is in prison. So I think
Hmm.
I don't know. Maybe that still sounds too utopian, but I hope there on the material basis of practicing solidarity, we might start to sort of bridge that gap. What do you both think?
I think that's really great. It made me think that this epithet of utopian socialist that has been used throughout all of Marxist history and is kind of leveled against a lot of people today, really shouldn't be directed at someone who says it's the ideal of open borders which drives me towards my solidarity with people X or whatever, or the ideal of there being no prisons, right, where everyone is free. That's not utopian socialism.
That's not utopian.
No, utopian socialism, in terms of which it should be used as a sort of epithet or as a critical term, is like people who are like, I'm going to follow Elon Musk to Mars or whatever, right? And then that's going to solve all the problems of resource scarcity or something.
I mean,
like that's utopian.
Yeah, it's also utopian to go, oh, when class first, when we abolish capitalism, everything will be fine. That's utopian. That's another kind of, that's naive, ungrounded, not very materialism.
Yeah, because
it's insufficiently materialist because it doesn't account for all the many causal factors that are involved in this contingent relationship with one another to produce the current reality.
Yes, because it like you said, Troy, it does think that only the material is material, and it can only think about the physical. It can't think about these other relations, at least not sufficiently.
Yeah, or whatever restrictive domain of objects, whether it's physical things or relations of power or whatever it is, there's some restrictive category of things, and that's the sense in which it's insufficiently materialist.
I tend to think, I think that's excellent. I mean, I tend to think that what interests me more than anything right now is I use this phrase, and I'm still trying to find the right wording for it. Right now, what I've kind of settled on is either a logical disposition to the world, and I use logical in the way that Sartre does in the Critique of Dialectical Reason, which is basically he develops what he calls a living logic of action, and by logic he just means the sort of idea of comprehension, which is an unconscious, like from Vorstellung, this like unconscious. It's not even a recognition. It's this unconscious appropriation and engagement, let's say, with the world, which he calls the intelligibility of the world. And so I refer to this like a logical disposition to the world or an orientation to the world, because I'm trying to figure out how I think about this. But rather than think about like a materialist orientation, politically speaking, but I think even philosophically speaking, as being something that has that is really concerned with particular ideas, like trying to realize open borders or something like that, which I think is a very valuable image to kind of offer up, because I think it has very like affective capacities, and I think it's a good fucking idea, because I do think that it is ultimately anti-capitalist because it opposes the logic of enclosure, but different discussion for a different time. But what I think is more interesting is the orientation that would condition someone to find that favorable in the first place. Or what is the condition or someone's orientation that would lead somebody to find that distasteful or problematic, right? And for me, I think that there is actually something about how it is that we comport ourselves, how it is that we actually align ourselves as we face the world. It's almost like a hermeneutics of praxis that I'm really, really interested in. And I think that a sufficient materialist orientation is one that allows for us to be like these open seers, right? You are like open to both the radical contingency of the world, which implies that you are aware that things aren't necessary, but they could be other, and therefore you are unwaveringly committed to an imaginative way of kind of acting and thinking and creating within the world. But simultaneously, you are also going to be rigorously analytical and critical of the material conditions because of that former idea as well. And so for me, it's more about like this like hermeneutical, embodied hermeneutical praxis that I'm concerned with. That I think that if your materialism is reductive, you don't have a sufficient hermeneutics of praxis because you are just kind of predefined. You will be, regardless of all the lip service you can pay to the ideas that, no, you're materialist and you need to allow history to work or whatever. You're still going to kind of like limit yourself if you aren't yourself kind of primed in this direction. And that's kind of where my head has been at now. And the problem is that it might be too subjectively oriented. And this is one of the things that I'm working through, is trying to figure out how to kind of like embed that, because it seems that I'm then just purely talking about like self. And I don't want to be just talking about self. But what I'm trying to figure out is how to incorporate like a radical subjectivity within this like hermeneutics of praxis that is robustly material and that is like unwaveringly imaginative. And that's really kind of like where my head is at right now.
I think one of the things that you might find interesting is like the early Marcuse, and in his break with Heidegger, because that in a way is actually, you're touching on some of the things that, I mean, Marcuse was fascinated with Heidegger in the sort of early 30s, and then immediately sort of saw, not immediately, but sort of soon got to see where it was going. And Marcuse is interested in the kind of existential question, right? That sort of, how do we do in the world? You know, how do we face the world, to put it in a kind of more Heideggerian terminology? But the important thing that Marcuse notes that Heidegger eliminates is that it is a we that face the world. You know, Heidegger talks a lot about Dasein, facing the world, I, a singular, but
yes,
but it really, if we accept this notion of a kind of dialectical relationship between self and the world, then we accept the constituted nature of our subjectivities, and we go on to start thinking about things like social production, and so we come to realize that it is we. You know, I mean, Marcuse was very individualist, you know, but he also recognized that we again, I keep using this plural, that it's a matter of how we understand ourselves as subjects, not simply a case of I, a singular subject removed from all else. So I think that's a really interesting point. You know, how do we understand what we're doing in the world and do it in a way that is both conscious of the problems and the challenges, but also the opportunities? There's that great line from Jameson's Postmodernism where he says that the kind of true challenge for dialectical thought, for a dialectical thinker, is to accept that capitalism is perhaps one of the worst things to have ever happened, and at the same time, and in no way contradictory to that, is also one of the greatest. You know, it's brought us huge amounts of pain and suffering on a global scale, but also because of capitalism, there is the potential to move beyond, to go on to the next level, to go on to a more just, humane, non-violent, sustainable arrangement of our economic and social relationships.
I like that you mentioned Marcuse. That, you know, obviously he's known for One-Dimensional Man more than anything, but I really love his essay on liberation that he wrote in 61 or something like that, or maybe it was later than that, like 67 or something. But where he talks about, and I think you and I briefly chatted about this in like direct messaging, where he kind of talks about where he's trying to wed together both the scientific analysis of critical theory, but also wants to be unwaveringly imaginative. And he says, but there's a problem. He says that capitalism has changed humanity at the biological level, what he calls the biological root. And he says, like, literally, our biologies have been constituted by these desiring machines of capitalism. And we need to then recreate humanity at the biological level. And he kind of speculatively muses on that. He doesn't really kind of like say how. He talks a little bit about like the hippies and their drug use and how this is one way to like biologically shift how it is that we orient ourselves in the world. He says, but that can, one, a trip only lasts for a short amount of time, and two, it's easily co-optable back into the grander logic. He says, but nevertheless, there is something really potent about that like flight in that moment of the trip. There is something interesting there. And he says, there's thinking at that level, is something that we ought to be able to be committed to in seeking liberation.
That sounds scary as shit, dude. I don't know about that.
Hey man, I think listening
It's
to
a one-way ticket to Frankenstein.
No, listening to Mongolian throat metal and enjoying basketball is some sort of equivalent. So don't worry, Troy.
Yeah, you're just trying to get me on board.
I am.
Showing me cupcakes.
Yeah, but no, I mean this is one of the things that I think I derive at least from Sartre's critique of dialectical reason is precisely these concerns that you mentioned with regards to with Marcuse, John. And even though Marcuse was critical of Sartre's existentialism, he actually, in a footnote, like years later, says in like the 70s, says, "Oh, but after when Sartre wrote the Critique, he kind of like abandoned his early kind of existentialist ideas that I was critical of before." And I think you do, he's trying to Sartre is trying to kind of like recognize some of his insufficiencies in his earlier work and his later writings. And I think you get people like Marcuse, like Sartre, people like in this sort of post-phenomenological tradition that are kind of articulating similar ideas to, I think, what we're kind of working through right now. And I don't know, man. I think that if we get our metaphysics wrong, and I know this sounds so wanky and so ivory tower and so fucking ridiculous, but I do think it's the case that if our metaphysics is insufficient, it really has profound impact on how it is that we orient ourselves, not just in the political world, but fuck in our love lives and in our family lives. And not that there's necessarily a one-to-one causal relation and it's always so neat. Someone could have amazing theoretical metaphysics and write the best books and their life wouldn't necessarily reflect that. But I do think that if we get that wrong, that's definitely going to lead to an insufficient output.
Do you think that Jeff Bezos' wife wrote that in the divorce papers?
Oh, shit.
Jeff was insufficiently metaphysically oriented?
That's exactly it, man. But she just got, I think in the state of Washington or wherever it is that they live, I think she's entitled to half of everything perennially. So I don't think she's going to say anything critical. Nothing critical. Yeah, it's just irreconcilable differences, Troy.
Irreconcilable metaphysical differences.
That's what it always comes down to.
Were you going to say something, John, before we cut you off there, or no?
No, we could keep going, obviously, but I'm happy to stop there if you guys are looking to wrap things up.
Yeah, why don't we wrap it up here and say that we'll just leave an ellipses here, and this is kind of stuff for us to chew on and for listeners to chew on, and then let's build on this again in a subsequent chat. Yeah.
I would be absolutely delighted to come back if you will have me. If you'll extend your hospitality once again, it would be a genuine privilege to talk to you both.
I would love it, man.
I know I, for one, would love to connect some of these things to your interest in Gothic horror, John.
Yeah.
I can see that there's a through line to that stuff, talking about the materialism of Gothic horror, and I would love to talk about that.
Well, I would really, really love to come back on and talk about that, and because there are two very interesting traditions within kind of Gothic Marxism, which is a materialist one and a more and one drawn from sort of surrealism and Walter Benjamin, which could be really fun to get into.
When is your book going to be out? Do we know?
Which one?
The one on Gothic Marxism. Yeah.
Well, what I'm going to do with the book is I'm going to write it, and then I'm just going to post it in installments on Patreon, so people can read as they go.
Cool.
I've sent it to a few publishers who were like, "Hey, this is great, but we're not gonna do it.
Do anything?
Sorry."
Yeah.
So I thought maybe let's just give it away. Let's just put it on the internet and see what happens.
Cool. Well, shoot. Maybe it'd be kind of rad to do something while that's going on. Is that going to be something in the near future, or is this like 2020 project?
I am going to try. I'm going to do two big writing projects this year for patron supporters. One of which is going to be the book, or the book length thing on Gothic Marxism, and the other which is going to be the third reading guide in my series of reading guides. I've done one to Jameson's Postmodernism. I've done one to the first 3 chapters of Marx's Capital, and this one's going to be on the Prison Notebooks by Gramsci.
Okay. Sick. Well, let's definitely plan something then in the next couple months here. That sounds rad, man.
Yeah, I would be absolutely delighted to come back.
Sweet. Well, I guess before you head off, where can people find you on the internet?
Yes, of course. You can find me spending way too much of my time at over on Twitter at TheLitCritGuy, at patreon.com/TheLitCritGuy. Please do think about checking out Horror Vanguard, which is at Horror Vanguard on Twitter. And we are, of course, on all good podcast aggregating platforms. If you need
Nice.
another podcast to add to your podcast diet.
It's so funny, man. When Troy and I started doing this, it was right before the most recent boom, and it was after I had conversations with friends that were like, it's too bad you guys are doing the podcast now after the golden age. There was like a golden age, maybe like 5 years ago, and then there was like a little bit of a lull, and then I don't know what started it, but all of a sudden, was it Chapo? It was fucking Chapo, wasn't it? Everyone saw how much money.
Probably it was.
Everyone saw how much money Chapo was making, and they were like, "Everyone should start a podcast."
It's become a very left thing as well. There is the left podcast scene, which is we're not like YouTube has always been sort of ideologically quite right wing, although that's changing in the last couple of years, which is lovely to see. But podcasts have always been where you'll find the Marxists and socialists and anarchists hanging out.
Wonder why that is. It's interesting.
Yeah, it's the Praxis platform, right? YouTube, you actually have to. You're basically watching a laptop in bed or something, right?
Yeah,
You ain't got shit to do. But if you're out there and you're engaging in Praxis, all you can do is listen to them while you do stuff.
Yeah, I think that's probably a really big part of it.
I mean, I know. For me, when I was going to school, when I went back to school after I kind of had stepped away for a few years, I went back to school. I was working at my job. I was fortunate enough. I know this was the same for Troy when you were working at the church, right? You would just have your earbuds in and clean and shit, and I would just have my earbuds in and do my work. And it was, I mean, we're talking 8-hour shifts, and I would listen to so many fucking lectures and debates and whatever else I possibly could. That's all I did all shift long. It was amazing.
So much content, so much good content.
I know. Well, sweet, man. Thank you.
You just got to make sure you balance that shit out, like 4 parts podcast, 1 part black metal.
Yeah. Or for me, like, some pop punk or something like that, to make yourself smile. You got to smile a little. John, thank you so much for coming on, brother. I really do appreciate it. And we'll just put an ellipsis here, and we'll come in and we'll pick it up where we left off.
Brilliant. All right.
Yeah, thanks so much, John. All right, that was a great conversation we just had with John. Oh wait, are we allowed to say his name? The LitCrit Guy.
LitCrit Guy. the John, a.k.a. the LitCrit Guy.
But now we're moving on to the final segment in the podcast, and that's the Sticky Leaves. This is where one of us talks about whatever it is that's bringing them meaning in a possibly meaningless universe. So, Austin, what's doing it for you this week?
So, I had like a really kind of interesting encounter the other day. Not encounter, but just a kind of like fun experience that made me think, and I wanted to kind of share it. And I've mentioned this before, that I've like for years I've trained on and off in like various forms of martial arts. And for the most of my life, I've spent it doing Muay Thai, but I've also spent a lot of time doing Jiu-Jitsu and some various other art forms, right? So it's been, I haven't been doing anything since I've been here in Sydney. And so I actually just recently started back up doing some Muay Thai. And I had a really lovely, I mean, beyond the fact just getting my ass kicked at the gym, and I recommend for people who are interested in martial arts, I love Muay Thai. It's, if you hate working out and going like to the gym and shit like that, look at doing some Muay Thai training. It's the best physical exercise you'll ever get, but it's also probably one of the most effective, if not the most effective, stand-up forms of martial art. But so I was training the other day, and it's a bunch of dudes. There were no women in this Muay Thai class. There are women in Muay Thai classes, but not in this one. So this was just a bunch of dudes training. And this particular coach kicks our ass. Like, he's known as the guy. Like, our warm-ups are like almost more than half of our training sessions, and they're not really warm-ups. They're like full-on like circuit training workout sessions. They're fucking gnarly. And he does that on purpose. Like, he wants us to get tired so that when we're actually doing combinations and doing our light sparring, that we're accustomed to what it's like when you're actually tired. So you still keep your form under those conditions, which is great. Fine. But so the other day, one of the dudes, we were just kind of like joking around or whatever, and he was tired, and the coach was like, "Come on, brother, push through it." And I don't remember exactly how he phrased it, but he basically made a sort of like what we would call like a sexist remark, right? He's like, "Oh, I'm just being a pussy." He's like, or something along those lines about like my vagina, right? And the coach, you saw in his eyes, he kind of hesitated for a second, and it wasn't like, I need to make sure that I correct this guy, but at the same time, he very gently did correct him and made it so that like it was very clear that that kind of mentality, not that it's not accepted in this gym. It wasn't like I'm policing you, like how dare you say that, but it was more like, but you have to realize that there are women fighters on this planet that are fucking badass, and to even use that phrase doesn't really obtain. It doesn't really hold. It doesn't have the purchase that we think that it used to have. And I don't even remember how he said it, but he said it in like one sentence and almost like a throwaway, and then the other guy was like, "Yeah, you're right." And then everybody started talking about this woman named Polyana Viana, I think is her name. She's a UFC fighter who got mugged in Rio de Janeiro. Did you hear about this, Troy?
I did not.
So she got mugged in Rio because, you know, she is like 5'4", 115-pound fighter, and some dude came up to her and didn't realize that she is a professional fighter, and basically told her, "I've got a gun, give me everything that you've got," or whatever. And she realized that he was at too close of a range to be able to pull out his gun in time, and that she'd be able to get off a few shots and debilitate him. So she punched him twice, kicked him, and then choked him out, and then held him down while the cops came. And you should Google this guy's face. It looks like he got into a car accident, bro. He got fucked up. But it was just so interesting. The reason that I wanted to share this was because so many people think of mixed martial arts and combat sports as being like, dude, bro, testosterone, I'm gonna fuck you up. You know, there was that dude during like the Trump primaries. Did you remember like the dude in like Huntington Beach or whatever, like this big ripped guy that was like, "Fucking make my burrito, Mexican motherfuckers," or whatever, like we're gonna build that wall and you're gonna build it for me, and all this other shit. And it turns out that he's like this guy that had trained in mixed martial arts, and he was this huge, like, you know, steroid head kind of guy. And I think that's like the stereotype that people think of, especially when they watch like mixed martial arts on TV. You know, the UFC, Bellator, One Championship, all these other fight organizations that have existed. But in my experience in the gyms, it has not been that way. And it has mostly been this kind of experience where, yeah, some dudes will throw around the P word and be like, "Oh man, I'm just being a pussy." But, you know, people don't really police that too much, and they're not too offended by that. But when somebody does say something that is kind of like more like, "Oh, the weaker sex," it's very clear within martial arts circles that, "Yo, motherfucker, have you ever met Kathy Long, who's like a martial arts Hall of Fame, 5-time world kickboxing champion?" It's like, she will fuck you up, bro. And not just you, she'll fuck up most dudes on this planet. So it's like, yes, you know, there are like biological differences, and generally men are bigger and stronger than women. That does seem to be the case. But at the same time, you know, there are spaces where we treat people with respect. And we don't try to use terms, or we don't try to use other identities in a way to make ourselves feel better because we're tired in this moment. And just because you're tired, that doesn't mean that you are a pussy. Just because you're tired, that doesn't mean that you are a woman. You know, even though I know that I'm being like kind of like overly sensitive here with how we use words and things like that. But I thought it was like a really lovely experience, and I was thinking about it like all day after I left, and I don't know why. And I think it was because the sort of paradox between how we generally think of those types of environments versus my experience of them as actually being these really kind of like lovely, supportive, and egalitarian environments. And if you go to a jiu-jitsu class in particular, you will see lots of women doing jiu-jitsu. I mean, you will in like a lot of cardio kickboxing classes, but that's just because they've been more marketed to women. But if you go to like more like Muay Thai, like proper traditional Muay Thai classes, you're starting to see a lot more women. It's still pretty dude heavy, but nevertheless, the respect is something that has been apparent in every gym that I've ever been a part of. And we're talking like 10 plus gyms around the world on like 3 different continents now. So I don't know. I just thought it was a really kind of cool experience.
Yeah, I know. This brings to mind like the way that the instructor responds to someone using the word pussy as this negatively connotated term. The normal reaction to that, and I agree 100% that it's normatively correct to not do that, or it's normatively incorrect to do that. Right? It's a form of even though it's usually unconscious and it's not purposely directed this way, it's sexist and it sort of can push people away and reinforces these stereotypes that are unhelpful, especially in certain groups. And like all that's correct, right? But probably for the most part, the wrong way to respond to that is to moralize at somebody, right? Because even though you're correct, if you sort of morally reprimand them or whatever, in at least in sort of popular American culture today, that just seems like virtue signaling, whether it is or it's not. And that's almost immediately a turnoff to 99% of people, especially people that would use that term in that way. And so I almost love the idea of just responding to it basically as if you had Asperger's, right? Just like taking it literally and then correcting the person. Like, no, there are plenty of pussies that beat the shit out of me all the time.
Right, exactly.
And it's like, because then you're clearly not virtue signaling because you're sort of being ironic, but you're also pointing out a fact. Like, no, there are women who can beat the shit out of me and you anytime they want. So you're kind of like, you're getting things factually and normatively correct, but doing it in such a way that methodologically you're not falling into this trap that's been set for you to sort of moralize at them.
Yeah. And you know what it is? And I don't know, maybe I am just mystified, let's say, by these communities because I'm embedded within them. But I can't help but think that part of it is because there's like a control and a self-confidence and an awareness that this coach or that someone that would wield that kind of response has access to. Whereas a lot of times the virtue signaling, like moralizing, comes from a feeling of a lack of control. It's, I need to respond. It's like, it almost feels like it's a panic response.
Yeah, other people are watching and they're expecting me to respond.
Right. Whereas this coach's response, I mean, it wasn't that. And it was weird. Like, I can still see the look in his eye. It was kind of like, he was like, and it happened instantly. But you know how you can like see something in someone's eyes and then afterwards you're like, fuck, there was so much that took place in that half a second. That was kind of what happened. It was like, he heard it. He wasn't offended. It wasn't like he was grossed out. It was kind of like, okay, I see what you're saying and I get it, but it's insufficient but all of that took place like that. And I thought it was really fascinating. I don't know. I kind of really enjoyed it. And I have been in that boat before. I have been the guy that has said that before and that has done that. And I'm trying to get better with not just wielding words, like you said, unconsciously that are part of like a sort of habit, especially because I've just been a part of like dude culture for so long, growing up playing sports and all kinds of different sports and sport communities, just hanging out with guy friends, going to the beach, chasing chicks or whatever when I was younger. Like that was the thing. So, you talk a certain way, you think a certain way, and you act a certain way. And so I'm perpetually trying to kind of like just become a better human. And so I've been in that situation before where I've been kind of like gently corrected by people. And then you sit back, but you don't feel like you're being corrected because it wasn't, for me, at least in my experience, it wasn't done like in a one-on-one. It was more like the conversation to the group was kind of like, oh, did you see how awesome these female fighters are? Or have you participated with these female fighters who are badass? And then I've worked with a lot of them. And then you just kind of start to realize like, oh, fuck, maybe the word pussy doesn't have the same sort of power that I used to think it does. Or maybe I shouldn't use it in a certain context. And maybe I ought to kind of consider how it is that words have power. So it's, I don't know, it's a perpetual process, brother.
Yep.
Well, sweet. So I guess we'll go ahead and wrap up the episode on that note. Thank you again so much to John, a.k.a. TheLitCritGuy, for coming on and talking. Thank you guys for tuning in. Thank you to Mubi for being a sponsor. Remember, go check out Mubi.com/owlsatdawn to get your free 30-day trial. Feel free to follow us on Twitter at owls_at_dawn. You can check us out on Facebook. You can email us, owlsatdawnpodcast@gmail.com. iTunes reviews, 5-star reviews, or 5-star rating and reviews. What am I forgetting, Troy?
You can also check us out on Patreon. Either the $2 tier, which gets you access to the polls for patron-sponsored episodes, or the $5 tier, which gets you access to that, as well as the newsletter and all the bonus episodes that we put up.
Sweet. Sounds good. I think that's pretty much it, right?
Just one more thing, dude.
What's that, man?
Das Vidania, Amerikanski.